No dobrze, to jeśli chodzi o mój zegarek, to już pokazuje 11, także będziemy
Dzień dobry.
zaczynać. Witam Państwa serdecznie. Także tutaj jeśli chodzi o początek tutaj spotkania, to będziecie Państwo wymiotowani. Natomiast jeśli się pojawią jakieś pytania, to proszę zadawać na czacie i na końcu w czasie sesji Q&A będziemy na nie odpowiadać. Także będziemy już zaczynać. Witam Państwa serdecznie na webinarium dotyczącym automatyzacji testów UI, tworzonej w kilku chwil za pomocą kilku kliknięć przy pomocy narzędzi od firmy SmartBear. Także ja nazywam się Michał Schubert, czy ten pan z prawej strony. Jestem oraz Sales Managerem w firmie Connect Distribution u dystrybutora SmartBeara. Zajmuję się doradztwem i sprzedażą oprogramowania, między innymi firmy SmartBear. I jest także z nami Vincent White, Solutions Engineer w firmie SmartBear, który można powiedzieć, że zna te rozwiązania.
No już.
Który zna te rozwiązania jak własną kieszeń i pokaże nam rozwiązania, także jak to działa na żywo. Także na dzisiaj przewidzieliśmy taką agendę, czyli kilka słów o dystrybutorze Connect Distribution, Michał Schubert, przedstawienie firmy SmartBear, to także poprowadzę ja. I postaram się zmieścić tutaj w 10, maksymalnie 15 minut, a następna część będzie już prezentacja narzędzi TestComplete i live demo TestComplete przeprowadzone przez Vincenta White'a, a na koniec przewidujemy, mam nadzieję, że owocną sesję Q&A. Dobrze, czym jest Connect Distribution? To jesteśmy dystrybutorem różnych rozwiązań informatycznych, tak zwany z wartością dodaną, czyli oprócz samej sprzedaży tych produktów staramy się jak najgodniej reprezentować producentów na naszym rynku, wspierając właśnie klientów, czy naszą właśnie wiedzą techniczną, czy tym, co o tych produktach, czyli tym, co o tych produktach wiemy, poprzez właśnie webinaria, szkolenia, wdrożenia różnych rozwiązań. Część produktów jest stosunkowo prostych, nie wymaga wdrożenia, część produktów są to duże rozwiązania, które wymagają większej pracy, aby w dużych organizacjach zadziałały. Jesteśmy na rynku od ponad 21 lat, także no można powiedzieć, że od wczesnych początków branży IT w naszym kraju. Działamy w 4 obszarach. Część to jest właśnie Network Security i Management. Tutaj mamy dosyć sporą reprezentację produktową, i rozwiązania dotyczące właśnie czy zarządzania hasłami, skarbcami haseł, resetowania haseł, narzędzia do zdalnego dostępu, szczególnie wykorzystywane w obecnym czasie właśnie, kiedy pracujemy mocno na home office'ach, narzędzia do wymiany danych właśnie dla dużych organizacji, które mają takie wewnętrzne, wyizolowane sieci, czyli bezpieczny sposób wymiany danych pomiędzy internetem a tymi wyizolowanymi sieciami, skanery podatności, narzędzia do testów penetracyjnych, monitory infrastruktury, także narzędzia antyphishingowe, różnego rodzaju firewall, web application firewall, next generation firewall i tego typu rozwiązania. W przypadku części storage'owej, wirtualizacyjnej mamy fajne narzędzia takie do przyspieszenia akceleracji wymiany danych wpływających data center i wypływających data center. Są to rozwiązania software'owe, przyspieszające kilkukrotnie tę wymianę danych właśnie bez inwestycji w kolejnych drogi sprzęt zajmujący także miejsce. Mamy także narzędzia wirtualizacyjne od Parallelsa, fajne narzędzia zarządzania wydrukami w dużych organizacjach rozproszonych, także często właśnie to zarządzanie wydrukami było kłopotliwe, jeśli ma się dużo oddziałów rozproszonych w kraju. Tutaj mamy na to fajne rozwiązanie, narzędzia do odtwarzania danych od zerto, które to nie są backupem, jest to troszeczkę inne spojrzenie na przywracanie danych, a także narzędzia deweloperskie, między innymi IDE, czyli takie środowiska do pisania kodu od JetBrainsa, narzędzia do tworzenia wersji instalacyjnych, narzędzia do konteneryzacji, narzędzia takie do tworzenia mapy myśli, pracy grupowej, zarządzania projektami od Mind Managera, a także gwiazda dzisiejszego dnia, czyli firma SmartBear, o której powiemy więcej sobie za chwilę. A także 4. dział to są właśnie systemy operacyjne i bazy danych, gdzie mamy reprezentantów MySQL, Oracle'a oraz SUSE. I tak wygląda firma Connect Distribution. Natomiast Natomiast teraz powiemy sobie więcej o firmie SmartBear. Firma została założona w 2009 roku w Bostonie. W obecnej chwili posiada 12 biur na świecie, rozproszonych właśnie po całym świecie, jak w Azji, Australii, Europie, Stanach Zjednoczonych. I co ciekawostka, także niedawno zostało utworzone także biuro w Polsce. Jest to biuro techniczne, projektowe, testowe, czyli tak można powiedzieć testowe, biuro do testowania narzędzi testowych. Mamy w firmach SmartBear w obecnej chwili ponad 15 milionów użytkowników, 24 tysiące zadowolonych klientów w ujęciu korporacyjnym, czyli firm. Także wprowadza narzędzia open source i jest dostępna w prawie 200 krajach. I tak chcę też powiedzieć też takich właśnie ciekawostek, że narzędzia SmartBear od kiedy powstały są synonimem jakości w całym takim software development lifecycle i używane do planowania, projektowania, testowania czy monitorowania naszych produkcji. Firma zdobyła zaufanie zarówno dużych i małych firm we wszystkich sektorach gospodarki. Jest to tysiące organizacji na świecie. Tutaj są pokazane firmy, które tak zgodziły się na bycie klientami referencyjnymi. W związku z tym te logotypy są tu pokazane. Natomiast jeśli chodzi o nasze własne polskie podwórko, chcę powiedzieć, że w każdym z tych sektorów, których widzicie, moglibyśmy wskazać kilku reprezentantów. Także wśród Państwa pewnie byście mogli sobie określić gdzie wasza organizacja, w którym tym sektorze coś pokazane się znajduje, bo na pewno także tu jest, na pewno także moglibyście się tutaj znaleźć. Firma także nie zapomina o community i firma jest zaangażowana w projekty open source'owe. W obecnej chwili są to 3 narzędzia open source'owe od Cucumbera, który jeszcze do niedawna był zewnętrzną firmą. Od 2 lat, jeśli dobrze pamiętam, jest częścią rodziny SmartBear. Podobnie jest w przypadku narzędzia Swagger i tutaj jeśli chodzi o produkty właśnie, to jest Swagger, który jest takim produktem open source'owym, a także Swagger Hub, który jest takim dużym narzędziem już komercyjnym, który można sobie także zakupić do zarządzania projektami i tworzenia projektów API. A także SoapUI, szalenie popularna platforma open source do testowania API. Jeśli chodzi o takie ujęcie produktowe, pomysł i misją SmartBear jest bycie takim pierwszym wyborem dla zespołów programistycznych każdej wielkości. Także firma dostarcza narzędzia, które szybko wpływają na dostarczanie aplikacji, a także działa na celu budowania, usprawniania procesów obejmujących automatyzację testów, cykli życia API, współpracę, testowanie wydajności, zarządzanie testami. No i SmartBear pracuje można powiedzieć nad całym cyklem życia oprogramowania, poprzez projektowanie, testowanie, zarządzanie testami, automatyzację, aż do przeglądu kodu. A wszystko to właśnie, żeby klienci dostarczali, żeby klienci SmartBeara mogli tworzyć najwyższej jakości oprogramowanie i dostarczać je na rynek. Firma zdobyła duże uznanie wśród analityków branżowych i klientów, także jak widzicie Państwo, firma jest uznana zarówno przez Gartnera, jak i przez Forrestera w ostatnich badaniach branżowych. W przypadku Gartnera wypada tutaj bardzo dobrze, jeśli chodzi o ten magiczny kwadrat, jest to lider, jeśli chodzi o tego typu rozwiązania dostarczane, które obecnie są dostarczane na rynek. Tutaj też trzeba powiedzieć, że właśnie wpływa też na to właśnie, czy zarówno stały rozwój produktów, powiększanie rodziny produktów SmartBear poprzez przejęcia firm zewnętrznych, ciągły wzrost liczby klientów, pozytywne opinie o produktach wśród community i wśród ogólnie klientów i branż. No i tutaj jeśli chodzi o to wprowadzenie takie początek to by było wszystko. Teraz chciałbym zaprosić już Państwa na konkrety, przejść do części automatyzacji testów i opowiedzieć o produkcie TestComplete. Opowie to Vincent White. Vincent, at the moment it is time for you, so you can start your presentation and the audience is yours.
So in terms of the demonstration, we're just going to go through the challenges of UI testing and how TestComplete can alleviate those challenges. And what we see here is a very basic Best Buy example. And I suppose the idea here is applications are made up of various objects on screen. So when it comes to testing, it's crucial that the correct information is being displayed on the UI layer. And sometimes this information is likely to change. So this is just an example, but you know, products can change, the SKU IDs can change, prices can change. There's also quite a lot of dynamic content. And as part of our validation checks, we need a tool that can extend all of the, I suppose, key challenges when it comes to UI testing, and particularly test automation. So when it comes to some of the challenges, we see it with desktop testing, where I suppose with packaged applications, predominantly legacy applications are, you know, older apps where test automation wasn't in the mindset of those developing the application, they can be quite challenging. We have different types of controls that we need to support and recognize. We also need to recognize different types of fields, like for the example, offset text, etc., and text within text boxes, all that kind of fun stuff. We also need to consider there's a lot of desktop applications, so the extensibility of support is vital, so then we can expose those elements for automation. We have challenges with web testing. So I mentioned packaged apps. As well, with packaged apps, there is a digital transformation happening, and web is taking the precedence with a lot of the main providers in packaged apps, your SAPs, your Oracles, Salesforce, etc. And the challenge with web applications would be, you know, there can be quite a lot of embedded elements. We have a lot of shadow DOM elements, iframes, custom elements, attributes, etc. There's also quite a lot of extensive frameworks and new evolutionary frameworks, or low code, or different types of frameworks, etc. So they can be quite a challenge to test when it comes to UI functionality. But there's also the bigger challenge, and that's scalability. So being able to test your UI on a Chrome browser, but also validate that it is working on a Safari browser, and ensuring that browsers can render our application correctly according to how we test. And I suppose that coincides with the mobile aspect. So when it comes to mobile testing and testing the UIs on different devices, different screen geometries, that's a challenge because we have lots of different devices. We have Android, iOS, and we have different screen geometries, etc. So being able to scale our web and our mobile testing is vital and important. We also have scenarios in which we might not have access to internal controls or internal attributes or exposure. And PDFs is a good example for trying to validate the content within a PDF where it's a single object. We need to figure out ways in which we can extract those text elements and validate those. But it's not just PDFs. We could have iframes, etc., canvas objects, and using methods like OCR allows us to extend our testability on applications. So very quickly, let's have a look at some factors when it comes to making UI tests more robust and, I suppose, scalable. And the biggest one, the first one is isolate. So isolating your tests from dependencies where possible. Identifying the most accurate object recognition approach for your application. We'll have a look at TestComplete and how we can look at different options. Improve maintainability by modularizing your test cases over time. It's critical, particularly with apps like your SAPs, your Oracles. Keeping your tests modular enables teams to effectively organize your tests as your framework grows into hundreds of different tests, but then being able to satisfy test cases a lot easier, and I suppose reuse your test cases against future releases definitely alleviates that maintenance pain and refactoring pain associated with test frameworks. When it comes to modularizing your test cases, it also enables reusability, as I said. Now, scalability, it's vital that we can scale our tests over different browsers and different devices. Confining our framework to just a device or to just a browser limits us in a sense that we can't get that test coverage we might desire. But also, if we need to test on things like different browsers, does that mean we can do it with ease, or will it mean having to duplicate our work efforts just for scalability? We'll have a look at how TestComplete can alleviate that in a demo in a short second. And then I suppose when it comes to critical or criticality, this would mean avoiding any kind of trivial UI tests that aren't important. Every test should be either an important user workflow or for the business or highly trafficked user workflows. So trying to distinguish what's important or what needs to be tested is obviously important. We have the ability to refactor or refactor with ease. So this idea of taking a dry principle or don't repeat yourself principle, using sensible variable names and other techniques to enable effective refactoring throughout your testing is definitely something that will allow your test framework to grow as it becomes more advanced and where advanced functionality is required. We have coverage. Coverage is always going to be something that is a topic, I suppose, with test automation. And increasing your test coverage with these is vital. And that would involve including things like any edge cases, negative cases for each test to ensure complete coverage and just avoid unexpected errors despite tests passing with a smoke test, etc. We have the ability to improve reliability by adding things like wait times for async processes, data loading, or other cases where you're asserting a state change. And again, that ties in with a lot of applications where we need to manage this using either static wait times or dynamic wait times, etc. And that kind of coincides with choosing a good test framework. And a good test framework isn't defined as good. It needs to satisfy a lot of the needs that we have. But when we look at testing and that journey for automation testing and test automation, we're going to have different types of users. We're going to have users who are familiar with test automation, typically would have a scripting background and they'll want to script when it comes to creating tests from scratch. They might have an existing framework that they'd like to use in their new framework, or they might be completely manual testers, have no scripting abilities, and they may wish to take a more scriptless approach. And just thinking of all of those considerations is definitely important when it comes to choosing an effective test framework. So when it comes to TestComplete, I suppose it's just good to kind of look at this from a high level. It's a UI testing platform for web, mobile, and desktop applications. So our extensive coverage is quite large. And we enable users to create tests regardless if you have a scripting background. So you can easily create with code or codeless test creation using keyword test practices. We have a centralized repository for recognizing different controls under test, and we can extend that further using other approaches if needed. When it comes to reusability, we make that reusability quite easy and seamless across the board. And in terms of scalability, we have a lot of different supported controls to enable scalable tests. And of course, we sit quite nicely into any CI/CD tool when it comes to continuous integration and continuous testing. But it's not all about CI/CD tools. It's also things like test management, issue tracking, source control. We integrate with all of the key testing integrations, like, as I said, CI/CD tools, defect management, test management, and source control. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up TestComplete, and we're going to get started with the tool. And just to re-emphasize it already, if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A panel. I'll take some questions after the session, but we'll answer them during the session as well if we can. And we're going to have a look now at TestComplete. So we should see TestComplete on screen. And essentially, this would be our start page. So here we can open up new projects, existing projects, some recent projects here, but we also have access to a lot of resources. So we've access to free training, support, documentation. I know Mikael mentioned it earlier about communities. We have over 97,000 community members, and we give you direct access to the community as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a recent project here, and it's pretty much a blank project. I've included some items, but I've also cleared out things like my object repository, etc. And when it comes to creating a test, we just need to look at some of the key controls. We can record a test, we can run a test, we can add parameters, and we can add variables. So when it comes to using the tool, this would be how a non-technical or someone who doesn't wish to script can use our tool. We can add operations, so we can easily add operations and add functionality to our tool or to our test. And on the left-hand side then, we have our Project Explorer panel, which just highlights some of the key controls. And those key controls would be our execution plan, our keyword test repository, our object repository then, which is our name mapping, and our script. So if you want a script, this is where we can script. And it's just good to know what our main items are. We can see that we can control items and use folders and subfolders to manage these, as you see here. But what we'll do is we'll just look at what's involved in creating a test quickly. So I'm going to click on record, and I'm going to create a web test. And again, this will be for a non-technical user. I'll then show you scripting and how we can alleviate scripting in TestComplete as well. So I'm going to click on record. We're now going to open up my web browser. Sorry. And we're now going to navigate to my application. And essentially, TestComplete is rendering and mapping everything that we interact with. So when it comes to object recognition, in the background, it's identifying all of our controls in the background. So if I hover over a control, we will see TestComplete is highlighting those controls. Now, one second, I think it's getting in the way of our screen share, but just 1 second. Okay, just bear with me. I might need to use a different browser because I think it's conflicting with the WebEx. So I'm just going to quickly open up Firefox. Okay. Okay. So now I've opened up Firefox here as part of my recording, and we can see that now TestComplete is recognizing these controls. I think it might be to do with the WebEx plugin on my browser, but essentially, as we hover over these controls, TestComplete is mapping out everything that we are recording. So in the context of identifying a panel, it's going to highlight these panels as we see on screen. And we can do this by we do this by object recognition. Object recognition allows us to map the items centrally, which is great. We have a dedicated repository, but also it means when it comes to reusability, I can easily reuse old tests. So if I create a test, I'm not dependent on the position of the control on screen. TestComplete has mapped out this control using criteria in the repository, and it allows me to reuse that again and again and again. Now, the beauty about this is even if I make changes to my application, if I add new criteria, I don't have to recreate tests again and again. I can manage this in a central location, and that will update to my tests where I've used these. And we can, when it comes to object recognition, we can actually choose different ways in which we can recognize controls. So there's lots of flexibility here. We can use object recognition to also add assertions. So we can see I can quickly add in assertions by just clicking on the blue tick or blue box, blue cross. We can add assertions using a checkpoint. So when it comes to different types of checkpoints, we can add in different assertions here to validate anything on screen. Or if you wanted to connect to a database, we can do this as well. So we can use our property checkpoints, we can use our text checkpoints, we can use image, file, table or grid. As I said, we can connect to any database using ODBC connection string, and we can also do web metrics. Property checkpoint would be the most popular. Why? Because we can leverage properties to satisfy our assertions. So if I was to, add in some text here, I can validate against that or validate against the presence of text in a different control. I can drag my target to the item I want to assert against, and we can see using attributes what are our options to validate. So here we have a preview of a screen where I've selected the object, and in the next icon we can select specific attributes to add into our assertion. So if you wanted to select text equals a certain value, or maybe you want to change the value altogether, we can add different conditions here. And again, we're not scripting anything. It's very easy to add in these assertions without the need to script. We can add in multiple assertions or multiple properties within our assertion. And we can also leverage OCR. So OCR is if we don't have any access to these attributes, as you see on screen, we can leverage OCR to extract text elements from an item on screen, extract that and use that to interact with, whether it's a PDF, whether it's a regular control, whether it's a canvas object. We can use OCR capabilities for validations, but also object recognition and interacting with controls as well. So that's just a quick run through, I suppose, in creating a checkpoint. I'm going to finish off this test, and we're going to finish off the keyword test that we are recording. Now, bear in mind, I opened it initially in Chrome and now on Firefox, so there will be a lot of cleanup required, but the concept will be the same in terms of how we create a test. So I'm just going to log out. I'm going to tear down the browser, and I'm going to stop recording. And what TestComplete is going to do now, it's going to record or generate every single thing that we recorded, including generating that keyword test in Chrome and now Firefox. And we can see there's conflicts here with different applications running. So again, this is the WebEx. We don't need that, so we can just delete steps here. We can delete that Chrome because we don't need that. We can get rid of these values here, and anything at all that's conflicting within our recording, we can get rid of. So when it comes to the URL, we're just going to specify the URL that we used and get rid of any unneeded parts within our test. Okay. I'm changing this because I didn't launch a URL in my browser. I just clicked on a tab, and that's it. So all of a sudden now we have a keyword test where we've launched our browser, we have logged in, we've clicked on a couple of controls, we have added in our checkpoint, we have then logged in, and we've followed through a flow. We have some operations here that we've used. We have some values, taking into account that the password has been stored as a variable. So we've stored the password automatically as a variable. We've a text description of what happened in our test. And yeah, that's essentially how we go about recording a test. So it's quite easy to generate that test using a keyword test. Let's see what we can do for scripting. So in a script, we can script off the bat if we want. This would be if you're a kind of more proficient user, or if you've got test automation experience. We have a built-in IDE and TestComplete. We support multiple scripting languages like JavaScript, Python, JavaScript, etc. And we give you the ability to script from scratch. So if you want to, we give you access to code completion, libraries, etc. You can script right away. You can also record directly into a script. So if you want to manage your tests and scripts, but you would prefer to use the recorder, you can record directly into a script. And if you'd like, you can also convert the keyword test into a script. So we can actually convert everything that we recorded into a script, where if we want, we can make any changes to this script as well. So it's quite easy to create tests in TestComplete, whether you are, or your users are technical or less technical. You have options using keyword-driven tests versus scripting. Going back to our keyword test, we can add functionality to this test. So again, as you've seen, we've taken out, we can easily edit tests, edit lines, we can make changes, we can add context to this. We can also data drive our tests quite easily. So when it comes to adding data-driven loops, we could literally specify lines in our test for execution, or we could specify lines, highlight these lines, and connect to external data sources for data-driven testing. So what I'm going to use is the user logging in. So we've got this user logging in SBA test. We have a password here that's stored as a variable. I'm going to very quickly change that variable to a constant or to a string, and we're going to look at data driving our test coverage. So I'm just going to use a random value. And now what I'm going to do is highlight my steps. Make a right click. And again, within my keyword test, I don't have to script. I can just use a wizard to configure whatever it is I want to do. And what I'm going to do is create a data-driven loop where I can connect to an external data source and data drive my tests from data externally. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it data example or data driven example. I'm going to click on next. I'm going to specify where that table is, whether it's an Excel worksheet, a CSV file, a database table, a database query, a table variable. I'm going to use a CSV file. And now I'm going to very quickly specify my file, which is user login. I'm going to take that data into TestComplete. We have a preview of that data. I'm going to use a comma delimiter where I have my tables here, my columns. I'm then going to specify a range. So if I wanted to use, let's say 100 records or 1, we can specify this here. And then finally, we can map this to TestComplete. So TestComplete will show us all of the data input fields where I have my, where I can potentially data drive. And I'm just going to link the column here, the password here, and I'm also going to update the checkpoint with here, with the email. And that's essentially my test data driven. I could use this with 100 records. I could use this with 10, 1, however, but the concept here is using a couple of clicks, we can easily data drive our framework without the need to script. So we can do this quite easily within a keyword test environment or a scripting environment. Scripting, if we wanted to script it, Again, we can convert it. So I'm going to convert this. And again, we'll have our data-driven test converted into a script if I wanted to. And again, the idea here is to get both sides of the house. So whether you're a proficient scripter or not, you can easily script this, you can convert to a script, or you can create a keyword test, depending on how you want to do that. So that's how we create keyword tests. That's how we data drive keyword tests. I'm going to now look at, I suppose, scalable options, because I talked about scalability a lot within our tests. And in this example, we can see that I've ran this test in Firefox. Okay, I've ran it. I've created the test in Firefox. I might want to run it in Firefox. I might want to run it in different browsers. So I could specify browsers here and run it, in Chrome or Edge or whatever browser is installed on my local machine. I might also need to run this on a different browser somewhere else, like on a Mac machine. We can easily scale TestComplete tests through other integrations, like our remote browser here, which would integrate into CBT. This is our device farm, SmartBear's device farm, where we can easily specify a configuration in our device farm. So if I wanted to run this on a Mac or in a Windows configuration, I can specify a browser that's installed on this, and we can actually run our tests at scale. I can select mobile devices. So if I want to scale my web test on a mobile, these are all real devices ready to test on. We have some simulators, but most of these are real devices. And again, we can easily scale our tests across these devices and specify a browser that we want to test on. And that will be through CBT, cross-browser testing. And this integration just allows us to easily create tests for automation, but also run them at scale if that's something that we need to do. Particularly for web and mobile, it's good to know that there's scalable options. As I mentioned, we have a central repository. So we can see that as I recorded these tests, TestComplete has mapped out the controls that we've interacted with. We can see all of the several controls that we've used. And that's all stored centrally within the name map. And this is what I meant about looking at this from a scalable perspective. Okay, we have the different controls that were mapped in TestComplete. So as I looked at the different objects here, we have our sign in, our login. We have different aspects of our application that was mapped automatically. TestComplete manages this in a central location using name mapping. And the name map allows us to manage this within a central repository. And this is where we can form our own criteria for testing. So we can see in this instance, we have this control called button login. Okay, this is a default name TestComplete uses. And the button login can be changed to anything. It could be, main login control. We can rename these names to suit whatever is domain specific for our application under test. And if I go back to my test, so that's done there, we should have that referenced in our keyword test. Okay, when it comes to the criteria, because we talked about criteria, we have the different selectors that we're going to use when it comes to recognition. So we have XPath, CSS. We can also leverage attributes for recognition. And this is quite important because essentially we have the various different selectors that we're using for recognition. And here we have the main selector, which we'll look to find first. If it doesn't find it, it'll look for the second, third, fourth. Okay, and the idea here is, we can build this up as we want. So if we want to use the best recognition that we want to include here, we can add this to the name map, and TestComplete will look for it first. But then we can add in other expressions if we want as well. And on the right-hand side, we can add in as many expressions as we want. So if our control is highly dynamic or subject to change or anything like that, we can add in fallback criteria, so TestComplete will recognize those criteria. We can also increase the priority of which TestComplete will locate those selectors. So we have the ability to remove or move up and move down, etc. So it's quite flexible in terms of how we might want to do this. For desktop testing, we can use attributes, both technical and non-technical attributes when it comes to name mapping. So why is all of this important? So the reason why this is all important is because we need to look at both sides of the house. We need to look at, non-technical users, technical users, and how this has all been managed centrally. And scripting is, something that is important to some users, so they might want to script. But you might have users which are mixed, which would be scripters and keyword test users. And how does that work in a tool like TestComplete? Well, it works quite well because, like I said, you can convert keyword tests to scripts. You can make changes to these. You can make them more refined or make them more robust, etc. But you could also run scripts in a keyword test. So if we have the requirement to do something a little bit more advanced and to configure it using keyword-driven operations is just a bit too much, or maybe it just takes a long time to do, or it's difficult to maintain. However, for a scripter, it could be done in a short time, and it might be easier to manage and maintain. In that instance, what we can do is we can take the script and we can actually execute it in a keyword test by just dragging and dropping it wherever we want. And that allows us to reuse scripts within keyword tests. So it's quite powerful in that sense. If we wanted to run script routines, it's very easy to do that. You can also reuse scripts for kind of quick tasks, like repeatable tasks, like logging in. So if I wanted to log in, I could actually script that, run my login script, not have to log in as part of my recording, and then start recording from the end position. So I suppose it ties in quite nicely with how we can get the best of both technical and non-technical users using TestComplete. It empowers non-technical users, and the great thing is wherever we maintain this on the left-hand side, this will automatically update wherever we have reused it in any other keyword test. But we can also do the very same for keyword tests as well. So I could create a keyword test for, logging in. I think I have one here in my comment folder. So I've got one for logging in. We can easily log in. We could create tests for logging out. We can create tests for launching the browser. We can also create tests on a component level or a modular level. And this ties in with the ability to use folders and subfolders. There's no limit on the number of folders that you might need. You can add multiple levels to modularly manage your tests and organize them into containers and folders. You can do the very same for scripts by just adding in new folders and subfolders if needed, etc. And just drag your items into the folder. And we can do this, as I said, on a modular basis. We can also build tests when it comes to, let's say, smaller components. And that allows us to then potentially execute these reusable chunks or reusable tests in tests. So if I wanted to, I could log in and again record my steps after I've ran that keyword test. It's good practice. It's good to have. However, it also sets us up for executing these tests independently as well. So rather than, having a login test in another test, we can look at our execution plan and execute all of our items in smaller components or granular components. This allows us for more effective maintenance, but also it makes it easier to execute our items. So I'm going to just click on the execution plan. This will bring us to where we need to run these tests or execute these tests. So we can, launch our browser, we can log in, we can buy an item, add in other tests, or if we want to run a script, we can easily do this here. And essentially, this is where we'll build up our regression packs. Now, on the screen, it will execute what's on screen in a sequential order. That being said, if we end up with hundreds of items, we can manage these into what's called test items. And again, these are just project items that can be called anything. So we could manage this in a regression pack, whether it's a release. Maybe we want to manage this in a release in sprints. So we could have, release 1.0. We could have sprint. And these are just test items, but they're used to organize our different executable items. And the same logic would apply. We would drag in our items here and effectively execute what we need to run. And we have our items here for execution. In our execution plan, we can check what we want to run, and we can uncheck what we don't want to run. So we can manage this quite nicely here in TestComplete. We can count how many times these are going to run. We can specify parameters. So if you have any parameters that we want to execute on execution, we can do that. We can define what happens if we get an error. We can specify this here. We can also link TestComplete items to external test case items. So for test case management, obviously integration is important. We integrate with Azure DevOps. We integrate with SmartBear's standalone solution, Zephyr Enterprise. We also integrate with Zephyr for Jira or Atlassian plugin for test management. And again, this works quite nice because we can integrate those items to TestComplete items on each line. And as we execute these tests, that will update what we have in an external test management tool. We can specify what happens if we get an exception, and we can add some descriptions here. If we wanted to connect these tests to CBT and run these tests on different configurations in parallel, we can configure these here within our parallel device cloud environment. This is just where we load the capabilities and assign them to each item here. And that's it. If I run this test now, TestComplete will execute these items, and it will generate a summary report. Now I'm going to stop the playback because I don't know what those items are, but essentially it's going to generate that report that shows us what ran, what failed, what didn't run. And this should coincide with, running a test overnight, seeing what happens the next morning, whether everything passed, whether we had failures, whether we had warnings, what didn't run, etc. And when we run from that execution plan, we can see what's generated in the test execution report. This will generate all of these items here. We can also go into the details. So just like if we were to run a test, we can see test logs, but we also get access to the logs in the reports as well. So if we were to see if there's any problems, we can analyze these issues within the logs. We'll have screenshots, details, etc. We also have, and just for a context, I stopped the execution here, so that's why we failed. We also have issue tracking integration, so we can integrate directly into Jira, and by logging into Jira or posting a defect into Jira, we can easily specify our defect. We can specify the details, and we can attach that log for our Jira users. And the log is everything you see on screen. So it'll have all the log details, the summary in Jira without the need to have TestComplete. It's shared as a log using a browser, an MHT log. We can export this log. So if you wanted to export this log, you can easily do this in TestComplete. We can export the log and share it ad hoc. and we can export the summary as a JUnit XML. And this would enable us to do reporting. So if you wanted to run reports against your execution, you can easily do this in TestComplete by exporting the log. And that gives you a sense of, I suppose, creating tests from scratch, adding functionality to your tests, then building your framework from the ground up. And as we build up our framework, we can look at execution, what execution looks like from a manual execution perspective. Very quickly, I'm going to show you what this might look like then in a continuous integration environment like Jenkins. So running this from Jenkins and seeing what this might look like. So this would be continuous integration, or CI/CD, running TestComplete from a CI/CD pipeline. And it's quite easy to configure in the tools like Jenkins because we have a support plugin. So if you wanted to run a test from TestComplete from Jenkins, this can be easily done by using our TestComplete support plugin. You can configure what Jenkins will execute. You can configure the nodes that Jenkins will execute your test on. And you can also enable Jenkins to distribute tests if this is something that you need to do. So if you want to distribute your tests on different nodes, you can easily configure this within CI/CD. Very quickly, I'm going to close TestComplete, and I'm going to run a test on Jenkins, and we are going to get an idea of what this might look like from a CI/CD perspective. And I suppose while that's running, if there's questions, Mikael, let me know, and I can address any of the questions coming through. So I'm just running the Jenkins build now. It's going to open up TestComplete. It might open up Chrome as well, so we'll just watch that. So here we go. It's launching my TestComplete project. It's going to launch, oh, it's launching Firefox, okay. So we're going to go through the test configured in my pipeline. As you can see, it's a demo March project on the right, on the far right-hand side. And it's just going through the tests that I recorded. And these were keyword tests, so these weren't scripted or anything like that. These were quite straightforward tests, like I've shown you in the creations that I've done. It's launching a cross-browser test now, so it's launching a test from TestComplete that's now connecting to CBT, and it's going to feed back in terms of what's happening. And I hope to get some errors, because that's the idea. We want to get some feedback. So we've closed TestComplete, and in this instance, it's just going to finish off the build, and we're going to get some results now in Jenkins. So my build has finished. I have some results. I have my logs. So everything that we see in TestComplete is shared in Jenkins. And I can see everything that's happened. So if I want to go into a test and see what happened, I can look at the errors. I can look at the lines in my test, go through the details, etc., and figure out what's actually happened here. And this is all through a continuous integration like Jenkins, or it could be as an Azure DevOps environment or something like that. So it's quite easy to link TestComplete tests into something like Jenkins or a CI/CD tool. You can then look at kicking off tests manually. You can look at kicking off tests periodically, or you can go for full automation and integrate your CI/CD tool with source control and fully automate the execution of your TestComplete builds. And that kind of coincides with the kind of demonstration that I want to showcase. I see someone, Dominic, has asked about testing desktop applications. So I'll take a minute to go through that. And I suppose testing desktop applications isn't anyways different to testing web in terms of how we do that in TestComplete. What we would need to consider for desktop testing is our application under test. So let's have a look, Dominic, and see what desktop testing might look like in TestComplete. So I'll use the same project, which is my demo project, and I'm just going to record a test from scratch. So I'll open up a new keyword test, which is test 7. And in my other screen, I have a desktop app. So I'm gonna make sure everything's closed. It is. So we're going to click on record. And I'm going to open up my desktop app. Okay, so it's opened. I'm going to drag it on screen. And here, when it comes to creating tests, the concept is the same. So you can see TestComplete is still recognizing the controls. We're still creating tests as we would using keywords-driven operations. I can add some context to this test. I can add in whatever details I want. And when I stop recording, TestComplete is going to do two things. It's going to generate my keyword test, but it's also going to add my application under test to TestComplete. So it's going to add the desktop app to our tested apps repository. And this is just another repository that we have in TestComplete. And the idea of using a tested apps repository is more specific for mobile and desktop testing, but essentially it's going to add that orders app here, that execution. So it's automatically going to configure runtime parameters. And we can also configure runtime parameters to automatically kick in if we're recording. So if I click on auto run the application on recording, if I click on record, it's going to launch my application to the state I need it to be at to generate or to record my tests. I can also launch the application from our tests. I can configure different runtime modes. I can add in additional command line parameters if that's something that I need to do to maybe expose some elements or anything like that in the context of desktop testing. But the general flow in how I create tests using desktop apps, as you can see, it's pretty similar. We have keyword tests, we have keyword-driven operations, we have our object here that's been recognized automatically. I can see in the name map, I go to the name map, I can see how TestComplete is recognizing that control. In this example, we're not using XPath and CSS, we're using attributes. And these attributes, again, is highly customizable. We can change these attributes, whether it's a technical attribute or whether it is a non-technical attribute. So I hope this is making sense, but this is kind of giving you an idea or a flavor of how we would recognize your app. So if I just open this here and go to the TestComplete, click on edit, we can actually see the criteria that we're using in the name app, and we have access to all of the criteria that could be used for recognition. So again, we can pick out different attributes here if you wanted to use these in the recognition. So I hope that's a quick answer to your question, Dominic. Is automating tests, desktop apps in Azure DevOps also supported? Yes, it is supported in Azure DevOps or more or less any CI/CD tool that you're looking to use, whether it's TeamCity, Bamboo, Circle CI, etc. TestComplete can be executed via command line or through CI/CD tools. So in some shape or form, you can potentially execute TestComplete builds from any CI/CD tool. But Azure DevOps is officially supported in the sense that we have a plugin for Azure DevOps. And it can also test desktop apps. Problem. One thing I didn't mention is source control. So obviously, source control can integrate with, your build pipeline outside of TestComplete, but you can also include TestComplete into your source control as well. And this is useful if more than one or two users are working on the same project. So integrate with all of the main source control, I suppose, players out there, your Git, even Azure-based repos, etc., Subversion, Mercurial, etc. And by integrating into source control, we would support all of the main operations. This would be for testers working on their own branch when it comes to TestComplete tests. And as you merge back, you can potentially then automate your workflows by merging back to something like Git. Git will then commit to your CI/CD and automatically test against any new builds, etc. So that can be fully automated if that's something that the team desires. Again, I'll re-emphasize, if there's any questions at all, I'm happy to take some questions. I know we've reached the top of the hour, so any questions whatsoever, just let me know.
I can see 3 Polish questions regarding the licensing model, so let me reply in Polish to those 3. Z tego co widzę, właśnie to jest pytanie też o licencjonowanie, czy jest to licencje są wieczne, czy tylko w ostatnio popularnej formie subskrypcji. Także jeśli chodzi o licencjonowanie SmartBeara, to jest różne modele są licencjonowania, natomiast w przypadku TestComplete konkretnie są to licencje wieczne, natomiast w formie subskrypcji jest wsparcie do tych licencji. Czy licencje są przyporządkowane do użytkownika lub maszyny, czy też mogą być pływające? Tutaj mogą być obydwie wersje. Także jeśli kupujemy tą taką atrakcyjniejszą cenową licencję TestComplete, one są przyporządkowane do maszyny, natomiast mogą być też licencje pływające, które może użytkować na każdej maszynie, która jest w organizacji. I czy licencja na jednego użytkownika może być na 2 urządzeniach? W przypadku licencji pływających jak najbardziej tak, w przypadku licencji node-lock, czyli tak atrakcyjniejszych cenowo, jest to jedno urządzenie. Okay, Vini, I can see also the more technical question in English for you, so I leave this one for you. So it is possible to download data during the test.
I see it there, yes. Thanks, Robert. I suppose context to that would be everything in terms of what we're looking to achieve. Like what kind of data are we looking to download? Is it TestComplete data? Is it during the test to the file from which we download? Okay, so if we're downloading a file from an online source or something like that, the answer to that is yes. So is it possible to download that data? I assume you might want to use that data. So I'll give an example for context. Like, you know, you might have an FTP server, or you might have a place where data can be downloaded to your local workstation. So that can be done in TestComplete. Why can it be done? Because it will go to a file explorer. Typically, your downloads explorer is where it might reside, and we can instruct TestComplete to then use that data if we want. So Robert, it's kind of a high-level answer, I suppose, because I don't have an example to show. But if you want to reach out to us directly, we can talk about different approaches. But definitely, it can be done. That's the one thing I will say. So the fact that you can download the data locally to your workstation, that file that you download will be stored somewhere. It will have a name convention, etc. We can then instruct TestComplete to source that file and use it, whether it's for data-driven testing or however we want to use that data within your flow, Robert. So hope that answers your question somewhat.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Because in terms of the chat, I think we replied to every single one. Okay, we have one more. It is more technical, so from Michal, so it is for you, Vini.
Yeah. I would like to use TestComplete as support to my manual testing. Is it possible to use a standalone or do I need to integrate with other programs for this? No. You know, if you want to alleviate the pains, you know, that is with manual testing, it can be used standalone. And Michael, I suppose the automation journey, that test automation journey, doesn't have to reside directly within, you know, a shift left or a dev environment or a DevOps environment. You know, typically people will begin using a test automation tool on a small basis, figure out what needs to be automated. That's a challenge in itself. deciding what kind of flows do we need to automate, what kind of flows do we want to keep for manual testing, like exploratory testing, etc. And determining on what needs to be automated could be based on how many times you execute a test manually. If you're executing as percentage of your test manually again and again and again, that could be a signal for automation to alleviate the time used to repeat those tasks manually. So definitely it can be used standalone. And I suppose even execution, and as we look at the framework, you might, as I said, execute a few flows, and that might maybe mature into 20, 50, 100 tests. But that still might be triggered manually, as in like you will hit run this every day or run this once a week, or you might even schedule your tests to run with Windows Scheduler or something like that. So absolutely, it can be used standalone. It doesn't necessarily need to integrate into other programs unless you need it to. The beauty about this, Michael, is it is a test automation tool geared towards automated tests. So we have an array of integration points if you ever need to do that in the future. Dominic has another question. From a standard scenario, test authoring for new functionalities and on-demand test running by pipelines, how many licenses are required? Is there a test studio authoring UI? Yes, good question, Dominic. Yes, there is. So from an authoring point of view, TestComplete is the author, a standard author, I suppose, when it comes to test creation. And it can also be used also for a test runner. Now, that's kind of, using TestComplete for execution might not be an efficient way of your executions, particularly if you need lots of execution licenses. So to alleviate that pain, we have a dedicated runner called test execute. And quite typically, our customers would use multiple test execute licenses or nodes with test execute installed in them to run TestComplete tests, whether it's for different types of applications under test, whether it's for distribution of our tests. We can get as many test execution licenses to sit into your pipeline on demand and run as many parallels or distributed tests as you want. So test execute is our dedicated runner. It's like a headless version of TestComplete. I think you asked another question as well. How many licenses are required? That depends on I suppose, considerations, I suppose, would be how many testers are using TestComplete at the same time. How many users are creating tests and building the framework. That's the main question that you'd need to answer. From an execution standpoint, I suppose it's easier because you have a more idea of how many machines do you have for execution. So whether you have multiple machines, whether they're physical, whether they're virtual machines, how many machines do you desire to run your tests on? That can determine how many execution licenses that you'd need. When it comes to TestComplete, it's more so who's using the tool and at the same time, because there's different licenses. There's node locked, which would be bound to the machine, and then there's floating, which would allow concurrent users to use TestComplete at the same time. However, it's set on how many concurrent licenses you have.
Okay, I think we extended our time, by 10 minutes. So I think we are going to the end slowly. So in terms of any more questions, so please send us a message so we can reply them via email if you remind something you would like to ask about. And at this moment, I would like to thank you everyone for joining to this session. Thank you, Vinny, for explaining the product, showing the product. And I think we are much more smarter after your presentation. Thank you very much.